Right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 11th University of St Andrews Carnegie Lecture, which is going to be delivered by Professor Sir Andrew Motion and is entitled Poetry and the Subject. Sir Andrew's lecture was first due to be given in 2020, but was postponed owing to the global pandemic. So Andrew, it truly is a great pleasure and an honour to host you here in St Andrews at last. However, before I introduce Sir Andrew fully, I would like briefly to reflect on the history of this lecture series and why it holds such importance to the University of St Andrews. The Andrew Carnegie Lecture Series was launched in 2014, thanks to generous support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, both as part of the corporation's centenary celebrations and to complement our own 600th anniversary. And it's a pleasure to note at this point that the latest president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York is now none other than Professor Dame Louise Richardson, my predecessor as principal and vice-chancellor here. The man after whom the lecture series is named, Andrew Carnegie, was born in Fife, but emigrated with his family to Pennsylvania in 1848 when he was 12 years old. After accumulating vast wealth through the Carnegie Steel Company, which he founded, he became a philanthropist of exceptional generosity. He was particularly supportive of educational endeavours and never forgot his Scottish roots. Carnegie sold his steel empire in 1901, and later that year, he established the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland, a charitable trust that for more than a century has funded student scholarships and university research across the country and is, if you like, a kind of cousin of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which was founded by Andrew Carnegie in 1911, with the mission of promoting the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding. We are very grateful to the Carnegie Corporation for enabling the series of which Sir Andrew Motion's lecture tonight is a part. Andrew Carnegie's links to the University of St Andrews go deeper still. He served as rector for 2 terms between 1901 and 1907, and the financial contributions he made to the university during his lifetime allowed us to extend our library and to build a sports field and a gymnasium. It is in the spirit of Carnegie's entrepreneurship and his appreciation for knowledge that the Carnegie Lectures aim to bring the world's most creative thinkers in the arts, sciences, education, and international affairs to Scotland's universities. It's fitting, therefore, that tonight's speaker is Sir Andrew Motion, Homewood Professor of the Arts at Johns Hopkins University in the US, and former UK Poet Laureate, of course. Professor Motion was educated at Radley College in Abingdon, Oxfordshire in the 1960s. It was here that he first discovered the work of Hardy, Keats, and Wordsworth, key early and abiding influences. Andrew then read English at University College, Oxford, after which he undertook an MLit on the work of Edward Thomas, another important influence on Andrew's writing. During his time at Oxford, Andrew won the Newdigate Prize, an award given annually for the best composition in English verse by an undergraduate student. He was also, as an undergraduate, he had the remarkable experience of meeting and being mentored by W.H. Auden, who was at that time being provided with accommodation at Oxford by his own college, Christchurch. From 1976 to 1980, Andrew taught English at the University of Hull, where he worked alongside another of Britain's leading poets, Philip Larkin, whose official biographer Andrew later became. Upon leaving Hull, Andrew became editor of the Poetry Review before serving as editorial director and poetry editor at Chatto and Windus. Re-entering academia, Andrew became Professor of Creative Writing at the University of East Anglia from 1995 to 2003, And then from 2003 to 2015, he held the same position at Royal Holloway College, University of London. Alongside these roles, Andrew was appointed Poet Laureate in 1999, serving until 2009, a tenure which, in the opinion of many, valuably redefined the way in which this particular office can be seen and inhabited. In 2016, Andrew took up the position of Homewood Professor of the Arts at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Many of us have known Andrew first as a poet, but across an abundant career, his writing has extended from poetry to biography, autobiography, and fiction. His recent memoir, Sleeping on Islands, is, however, tellingly subtitled A Life in Poetry. Like his poems, like everything he writes, in fact, that book combines a kind of candor, immediacy, and craft that is entirely distinctive and highly compelling. Andrew's first collection of poetry was The Pleasure Steamers, published in 1978, and I'm holding up, I showed this to Andrew earlier, my own copy. I recall this, of course, as a collection which, in my case, memorably distracted me both before and after my English finals in Oxford that year, with other early collections, including Dangerous Play, Poems 1974 to 1984, published in 1984, which received the John Llewellyn Rhys Prize, and Natural Causes in 1987, which won the Dylan Thomas Prize. More recent titles include Essex Clay in 2018, Randomly Moving Particles in 2020, and New and Selected Poems 1977 to 2022 in 2023. Andrew has written biographies of the poets Philip Larkin and John Keats, and his novels include The Invention of Dr. Cake, 2003, Silver, Return to Treasure Island, 2012, and The New World, 2015. He has also published autobiographical prose, including a memoir of his childhood, In the Blood, 2006, and recently, as I mentioned, Sleeping on Islands, A Life in Poetry. Andrew's own writing stands alongside his commitment to education and to making poetry accessible to all. He is the co-founder of the Poetry Archive, a not-for-profit organisation that produces, acquires, and preserves recordings of poets reading their own work out loud, thereby saving for future generations valuable voices which might otherwise be lost. As part of the Poetry Archive's work, Andrew established Poetry by Heart, a national competition which has inspired hundreds of school-aged children across the UK to learn and recite poetry. Professor Motion's work has been widely recognised. He received an honorary doctorate of letters from Anglia Ruskin University in 2001 and was knighted for his services to literature in the Queen's Birthday Honours in 2009. After this evening's lecture, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions to Andrew. He's very kindly agreed to that. We do have runners with microphones, so please do wait for them to reach you if you can. And the evening will then conclude with a vote of thanks from Professor John Burnside from the School of English. For now, please join me in welcoming Sir Andrew Motion to deliver the 11th University of St Andrews Carnegie Lecture, Poetry and the Subject. Andrew.
Thank you so much for that more than generous introduction. My life flashed before me in a rather terrifying way. Good evening, everyone. Very nice to see you. Thank you for coming through the rain to listen to this. As I say, thank you very much, Dame Sally, for your generous invitation and your very generous introduction to give this year's Carnegie Lecture. I feel honoured by it, and I'm grateful for it. Though, as you're about to hear, this won't be a lecture in the sense that it advances an argument, illustrates and elaborates it, then issues a ringing conclusion. Instead, I'm going to speak in a relatively conversational way, taking my mind for a walk in the same spirit that Paul Klee meant to invoke when he said that he took a line for a walk when he made a drawing. My intention is to allow myself a degree of indirection to reflect what I take to be an essential aspect of my topic. Thank you to Audrey Dice, sitting at the back there, for your great help in making the arrangements that brought me here, more complicated than they might have been, given that I had to travel almost 4,000 miles. And thank you, as I've already said, audience, for being here to listen to me. It's a special pleasure for me to speak to you in St Andrews, since I have so much admiration for your university as a whole, and your English department in particular, a faculty that includes some of my oldest friends and acquaintances. But I also have differently personal reasons for feeling this sense of connection. My eldest son, Jesse, was a student at this university in the early years of this century, and I have happy memories of visiting him here during his own happy incumbency. Furthermore, until my great-grandfather, also called Andrew, moved south in the last years of the 19th century, my father's family used to live here. Several of them, and I went to see them this afternoon, are buried up the road in the graveyard of the old cathedral. Their proximity gives me a slightly uncanny feeling, the sort that comes when we can't quite see what we mean or can't quite say what we feel. Given that I want to spend the next hour or so thinking about the merits of saying things indirectly or implying them by various means, this is not inappropriate. As Dame Sally has reminded you, I was first asked to give this lecture in 2020. I think the invitation came in 2019, and gladly signed up for it, thinking that I'd take the opportunity of a significant anniversary in the posthumous existence of Wilfred Owen to talk about his poems. Owen was killed in 1918, a week before the end of the war, but his poems weren't collected until 1920. My plan was to use the centenary of their publication as a pretext for looking at the whole body of his work, for which I have strongly affectionate admiration, and to concentrate on two aspects that I think are connected. Firstly, on the way Owen warms and deepens and colours his sympathy for fighting soldiers by infusing it with various kinds of homoerotic celebration and or grieving. Think Walt Whitman with a Welsh accent. And secondly, on the way that his best poems often depend for their power on taking an unexpected position, I mean physical position, which connotes an emotional or intellectual one in relation to their subject, which in a fragmentary preface he did not live to finalize. He specifically identified his subject, as war and the pity of war. These vantage points, which are paralleled and supported by the acoustic displacement Owen creates in his frequent use of pararhyme, include looking down from a great height, a phrase from his poem, The Show, which perhaps owes something to Hardy, who was also rather disposed on looking down on things in that way, especially in the dynasts. Looking underground in Strange Meeting, which perhaps owes something to Keats, the poet Owen admired above all others, and his poems, Hyperion and The Fall of Hyperion. Or looking from behind the lines in my favourite of all his poems, The Send-Off. These variable placements of the speaker would be striking in any poet, but for one whose reputation appears to rest so securely on poems of brutally direct address, dulce et decorum est, futility, counteroffensive, it's especially significant. It suggests, among other things, I think, that an interesting link might exist in his work between personal feelings, his sense of being a gay outsider, and poetic practice, adopting an ostracized point of view. It also suggests that the impression his poems give of being in the thick of action might in fact depend on the very opposite, on speaking from an objective distance. Philip Larkin, for instance, to whom I'll return in a moment, uses more kindly language about Owen than Yeats, who notoriously referred to Owen's poems as blood and dirt and sucked sugar stick, but nevertheless outlines what is essentially a Yeatsian attitude when Larkin reminds us, that for some readers, the authority of Owen's poems is restricted by their being mostly convulsive. Larkin says, however much we agree that the war happened and ought to be written about, there is still a tendency for us to withhold our highest praise on the grounds that a poet's choice of subject should seem an action, not a reaction. The Wreck of the Deutschland, Hopkins's famous poem, Larkin goes on to say, the Wreck of the Deutschland, we feel, would have been markedly inferior if Hopkins had been a survivor from the passenger list. It's a poem about a boat that sinks and kills a lot of people. You can see what Larkin is trying to do here, make out that the war hurt Owen into poetry and suggest that his writing depended on his circumstances to a degree that diminished his agency as a writer. But as I say, this argument is undermined by the various points of view that Owen devises for his poems and in particular by the send-off. So here's the poem. Down the close darkening lanes, they sang their way to the siding shed and lined the train with faces grimly gay. Their breasts were struck all white with wreath and spray, as men's are dead. Dull porters watched them, and a casual tramp stood staring hard, sorry to miss them from the upland camp. Then, unmoved, signals nodded, and a lamp winked to the guard. So, secretly, like wrongs hushed up, they went. They were not ours. We never heard to which front these were sent, nor there if they yet mock what women meant who gave them flowers. Shall they return to beating of great bells in wild trainloads? A few, too few for drums and yells, may creep back, silent, to village wells, up half-known roads. This entire poem is a kind of hymn, a dirge, to things that are half-known. The lanes we see in the opening line are darkening. The departing soldiers are imagined as being in a place that already situates them somewhere between life and death. Their breasts were struck all white. Their means of dispatch is a form of secret, and so is their destination. We never heard to which front these were sent. And whoever it is that returns, a few, too few, will come back silently, either because they're returning as ghosts, or because what they've been through has rendered them speechless. In either case, Owen says, they're likely to find a landscape they only half recognize, partly, again, because of the damages and deprivations they've endured while away, but also because home itself is a changeable thing. It never stays as we left it. Pache Larkin in his poem, Home is So Sad. Time ousts us from the past, even as it allows us to discover a new present. As I say, this is what I wanted to talk about when I thought that I was coming to you in 2020. But COVID put paid to that, and when the idea of my visit was renewed and Owen's anniversary has passed, I thought I'd better come up with a different subject. I'd spent a lot of time during lockdown rereading Homer and become fascinated by the character of Elpenor. By who? Elpenor is an oarsman on Ulysses' ship, but to call him a minor figure in the Iliad and the Odyssey is a serious understatement. We don't hear about him at all in the first poem, and in the latter one only meet him very briefly at the end of Book 10 and the beginning of Book 11, then briefly again at the beginning of Book 12 when we read about his funeral. But his afterlife is substantial. His shade is refigured by Virgil in the Aeneid as Palinurus, who himself has been revitalized by writers as diverse in time and temperament as William the Breton, whose 13th century poem, The Philippide, compares him to Christ, and of course Cyril Connolly, who in the mid-20th century took his name as a pseudonym when he published The Unquiet Grave. He's reinvented as Paddy Dignam in episode 6 of Joyce's Ulysses. He's referred to in Ezra Pound's Hugh Selwyn Morbally, as well as in the first of the cantos. He's the subject of poems by Archibald MacLeish, Sepharis, and Derek Mahan, among others. And as a character with his name appears in the video games Assassin's Creed, Odyssey, and Rock of Ages 3, Make or Break. I want to reassure you that actually I had to research that rather than watch the whole thing through. Anyway, there he is. So why has Elpenor, who has so little to say for himself, attracted so much attention from others? It's tempting to say that readers feel sorry for him and leave it at that, but the answer is more complicated and illustrates, among other things, how loudly understatement can resonate and how a well-timed glancing blow can be as effective as an uppercut. But first things first, who is he exactly? In Emily Wilson's recent translation of the Odyssey, he's described by Homer as the youngest member of Odysseus' crew, not very brave in war, not very smart, and indeed, that's the line, not very brave in war, not very smart. And indeed, his one recorded mortal act is a fatal blunder. Having inconspicuously outlived most of his fellow sailors on the way back from Troy, maybe he's not so stupid and cowardly as Homer says, but simply good at avoiding trouble. He dies in an accident after Circe has told Odysseus that if he, Odysseus, wants to get back to Penelope at long last, he must first visit the underworld and consult Tiresias, who will tell him the way home. That's to say, Elpenor is still half asleep in the grounds of Circe's palace when he hears Odysseus' ship preparing to leave, realizes that he's about to miss the boat, literally, leaps to his feet without remembering that he's been sleeping off his hangover on a rooftop and falls to the ground. Or as Homer Emily Wilson puts it. He heard the noise and bustle, the movement of his friends, and jumped quickly, forgetting to climb down the lofty ladder. He fell down, crashing headlong from the roof, and broke his neck, right at the spine. His spirit went down to Hades. So far, so ignominious. But it turns out that Elpenor's death is what Roland Barthes would have called a punctum in the poem, a moment of particular concentration and revelation, for the very simple reason that it's so extraordinarily ordinary. Among the literally hundreds of heroic deaths that occur elsewhere in Homer's poems, this one strikes us as being the most humdrum, which also makes it the most familiarly human. For that reason alone, it stands out and becomes memorable. But this is not the same as saying that Elpenor's death has nothing to do with the main concern of the poems. Look what happens when we get to the underworld. Circe has led Odysseus to believe that Tiresias will be the first to appear and speak to him, and he's therefore taken aback when he finds that Elpenor is the first in line of those waiting for him. "How did you come here in darkness?" Odysseus asks. "You came on foot more quickly than I sailed," and then proceeds to anticipate the answer he will receive in due course. "We left your body in the house of Circe without a funeral or burial," Odysseus says, breaking down and weeping in pity. Elpenor responds to this show of sympathy with a groan, a sound which, while it dramatizes his grief, also introduces a reply of such candor that we realize death has dissolved the social barriers and other kinds of inhibition that governed the two men while they were both above ground. "Lord Odysseus," Elpenor says, "you master every circumstance. But I had bad luck from some god. Too much wine befuddled me. In Circe's house I lay upstairs, and I forgot to use the ladder to climb down from the roof. I fell headfirst. My neck was broken from my spine. My spirit came down to Hades. By the men you left, the absent ones, and by your wife and father who brought you up from babyhood, and by your son Telemachus, whom you abandoned alone at home, I beg you, when you sail from Hades and you dock your ship again at Aea, please, my lord, remember me. Do not go on and leave me there unburied, abandoned, without tears or lamentation, or you will make the gods enraged at you. Bury me with all my arms and heap a mound beside the grey salt sea, so in the future people will know of me and my misfortune. And fix into the tomb the oar I used to row with my companions while I lived." This short speech, 22 lines, is the only time we hear Elpenor's voice in either of Homer's poems, and it's noteworthy for this reason. But it's also remarkable for the range and intensity of feeling that it contains. It begins respectfully, then shifts to self-blame, then to factual reporting, then to beseeching of a kind that contains veiled but justified criticism of Odysseus as a leader, then to a more obviously threatening kind of appeal, then to pitiful imploring, before ending with a practical request which is at once strange, appropriate, faintly amusing in its humility, yet rightly proud. Equally striking, and this is the point I want to make most strongly, is the number of parallels it contains to appeals that have been made by much grander and more glamorous figures in the poems, including Patroclus and Hector and Achilles, for burial and proper remembrance. In all these respects, Elpenor's words represent more than just the understandable wish to make a decent end. They pull together threads which run backwards and forwards through the entire length of both poems. Insignificant as he might be in purely narrative terms, Elpenor in fact exposes and emphasizes the main themes of the poems. Respect the dead, honor them regardless of their earthly status, bury them properly, and remember them. The fact that Elpenor is a kind of anti-hero, young, stupid, and cowardly, only makes what he says more compelling. "Poor man," Odysseus answers, when Elpenor has completed his list of requests. "I will do all this." You'll realize from what I've been saying about the lecture I wrote and didn't give about Owen, and the one I wrote and didn't give about Elpenor, because my arrangement with St. Andrews then fell through for a second time, that the two have a lot in common. Not just because they're both concerned with war poetry and how to honor soldiers without sentimentalizing conflict, but also because they're interested in the way that Owen and Homer like to come at their subject from a surprising angle. Put simply like that, the benefit of surprise in poetry might not seem all that surprising. Isn't it something that all writers want to achieve most of the time? As I mentioned in a little class I gave this morning, there's a story I like very much about Elizabeth Bishop, who, after reluctantly agreeing to serve as one of the judges of a poetry competition, was asked what she wanted to see in the winning poem. Oh, she said, with a nice mixture of deprecation and pessimism, I just want to be surprised. But what I mean to acknowledge in mentioning surprise is more than simply the appeal of the unexpected. I mean rather to register the way that romantic, capital R, romantic and post-romantic poetry, and in particular modernist and postmodernist poetry, often self-consciously explores its relationship to subjects by confirming that they need to exist in order for the poem to exist, while at the same time insisting that any representation of a subject's true nature must also take account of its inaccessibility or its resistance to direct approach. For this reason, I'm not going to proceed in the same confident fashion Daniel Brown does in his recent book called Subjects in Poetry, by discussing how poems say by expressing, say by evoking, and say by addressing, and so on, illuminating as those approaches can be. Instead, I'm going to talk about obliquity, hesitation, diversification, implication, and that sense of the uncanny I mentioned a moment ago. Before I start to do that, let me give some definitions. When I use the word subject apropos of a poem, I mean the person or event or thing that it directly or indirectly deals with, from which the theme, the message, the life lesson arises. And having already said something about Homer, let me limit the time frame of what I'm going to talk about so that I can concentrate on the period where my thoughts are likely to have most traction, which is to say the last 200-odd years. Although I'm aware that in earlier times, a great deal of elegiac writing and religious poetry, which are both centrally concerned with the immaterial, ineffable, although I'm aware that that often makes a point of suggesting that it can't say everything it wants to say, the great mass of other kinds of pre-romantic writing tends not to spend much time quizzing the nature and or availability of its subjects. But by the end of the 18th century, and particularly as literary criticism began to find its feet 100 years later, this comparatively unself-reflective way of writing was beginning to seem complacent, a form of unexamined life. Against such a background, it's not surprising that one of the first writers to adopt a more deliberately self-conscious approach should have been someone who felt at odds with the poetic universe she wanted to join, because she was a woman, because she was temperamentally inclined to set herself at an acute angle to her surroundings, and because she was simultaneously deeply respectful of tradition and also determined to establish a distinctly personal alternative to it. I'm talking, of course, about Emily Dickinson and her famous poem that begins, "Tell all the truth." Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. This poem is an embodiment of paradox. It speaks directly about the value of indirection. In this respect, it's typical of Dickinson's work, which generally enjoys paradox a great deal and tends to elaborate the enjoyment by putting metaphor to work in the service of illuminating plain facts that derive from observation and thought. Here, in two quatrains which create the impression of being a single closed unit, a tight little box of artfully engineered sound effects, half rhymes as well as full rhymes, the lightning strikes with explosive force. The effect, and this is also typical of Dickinson's way of the way Dickinson's poems operate, the effect is to make a rather doctrinaire poem, a poem that has a clear and definite subject, feel, if not exactly elusive, then at least conscious that its form, at once simple and complex, traditional and highly inventive, can barely control its content. It comes to us, like so many of Dickinson's poems, sounding at once boldly confident, wagging its finger in our faces and admonishing us to tell all the truth, and shyly nervous, because the truth can blind us. It preaches its lesson and illustrates it at one and the same time. I don't see much of this engagement with the nature of poetic subjects or much discussion of the best ways to treat them in poems by Dickinson's English contemporaries, though I suppose you could say Browning shows it in his dramatic monologues, which require the reader to interpret the motives and characters of their speakers, not from what the author tells us about them, but from what the speakers themselves have to say. My Last Duchess is an obvious example. But I do see it emerging decisively in the work of at least one of Dickinson's fellow Americans in the generation that succeeded her own. A novelist, admittedly, but a novelist who exerted an exceptionally powerful influence on poets in his own day and subsequently, Henry James. In his essay, The Art of Fiction, published in 1884, 16 years after Dickinson wrote Tell All the Truth, James has this to say: "The power to guess the unseen from the seen, to trace the implication of things, to judge the whole piece by the pattern, the condition of feeling life in general so completely that you are well on your way to knowing any particular corner of it. This cluster of gifts may almost be said to constitute experience, and they occur in country and in town, and in the most differing stages of education. If experience consists of impressions, it may be said that impressions are experience, just as, have we not seen it, they are the very air we breathe. I wonder whether Eliot was remembering this remark about impressions being experience when he said in his essay on the metaphysical poets, first published in 1921, that a thought was an experience to done. The phrase appears as part of Eliot's argument that the metaphysical sensibility is no longer to be found among his contemporaries. Actually, James's essay suggests this might not have been the case. In all events, whether or not James was midwife to the thought of Eliot's, what we can hear in these sentences from the art of fiction is modernism beginning to come to its senses. The self-consciously writerly conviction, I mean, that in the presentation of a piece of writing, awareness of process plays at least as important a role as description, as characterization, or as any statement of fact and circumstance. And it implies that in the honest response to any experience, caution or even bafflement about the experience itself, as well as the language in which it's conveyed, will play its conspicuous part. As literary historians know very well, this new emphasis had been anticipated and then found strong support in France, long before it received any endorsement from writers based in England, from Baudelaire, from Mallarmé, from Laforgue, and a little later from Paul Valéry. Valéry, for instance, in the wonderful notebooks and albums that he began compiling in the 1890s and continued adding to until his death in 1945, returns time and again to the idea that a poem is not the versification of an idea, not the confident embrace of a subject, but, and I absolutely love this phrase, a prolonged hesitation between sound and meaning, a prolonged hesitation between sound and meaning. Maybe, he says in 1894, the poet will only, and these are translations of my Nathaniel Rudavsky-Brody, maybe the poet will only leave a formless pile of glimpsed fragments, sufferings broken against the world, whole years lived in the space of a minute. In 1916, describing the solemn silence of a single forest, he says, everything is in suspension, everything merely glimpsed. Light and cold shadow are distributed following the haphazard seeds and acorns fallen in another time. In 1935, he says, everything is revealed with strong contrasting shadows. The rough sketch becomes precise. Each part subdivides further. Each fragment can live its own life. And in 1944, shortly before his death, he reports on himself as reaching that point of wisdom, that is, of limpid observation and untroubled gaze, where death would mean as little to us as it does for the nature of life, which dissipates beings as it creates them, torments and tortures them as it nurtures them, makes them sensitive as it makes them heavy and mobile, and in sum is ignorant of each one as each is ignorant of its immense production and perceives neither its foresight nor its contradictory ways, nor the meaning of its development, and this mixture of genius, blindness, variety, and mechanical monotony, which it presents to us, we who judge it after ourselves. These are the kinds of assessment of human experience and the aptly subtle way that it deserves to be represented in writing that became central to the modernists, both in prose, Woolf, Joyce, Gertrude Stein, and in poetry, Eliot, Pound. But let me say something about Eliot in particular. His debt to James and 19th century French writers is well attested. His preludes share a language and an attitude with Laforgue in particular. His portrait of a lady invokes the shade of James in its title and fastidious hand-wringing. His Prufrock, the character I mean, as well as the poem in which his love song is recorded, embodies the interrogation of subjects that I've been talking about in its 100 indecisions, 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. And its incessant delaying tactic questions, do I dare disturb the universe? Should I then presume? And how should I begin? And in its self-doubt, shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? Generally, as these quotations attest, there is an element of wry comedy involved in both the self-examination and the examination of process, which suggests that the origin of their speaker's misfortune lies partly in their wondering whether they themselves deserve to be taken so seriously, But by the time Eliot writes The Wasteland, this self-deprecating note has all but disappeared and been replaced by something more straightforwardly tragic. Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many, I had not thought death had undone so many. I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. At my back in a cold blast, I hear the rattle of the bones, and chuckle spread from ear to ear. These fragments I have shored against my ruin. More tragic, as you can easily hear, but similarly preoccupied with the feeling that when it comes to reporting on experience, on subjects, it's impossible for Eliot to say exactly what he means. The poem's use of quotation, illustrated by the various kinds of pastiche in all these quotations, only confirms this feeling of disablement. It reminds us that part of the difficulty of speaking in the present has to do with the fact that, as Eliot himself said, the past is all we know. The reputation of The Wasteland grew so fast and so far, it's tempting to think that it swept all before it, poetically speaking. Tempting, I mean, to think that once the previously firm foundations of the subject had been undermined, they were never to be re-established. We can trace its impact in the pronouncement of poets as various as Archibald MacLeish, a poet should not mean but be, and more recently W.S. Graham, whose preoccupation with the slipperiness of language and the haunting evanescence of subjects gives his work its defining shape. Language, now you have me, or here I go on the other side of language, and the great age of language floors me. But looking aside from Eliot to his contemporary Robert Frost reminds us that it would be a mistake to think the modernists carried all before them. Frost, with the same mixture of curmudgeonliness and folksiness that characterizes a great deal of his behavior, acknowledged the achievements of the modernists, but he more obviously, at least on the face of it, refused to follow their example. And at the center of the dislike he felt for their fragmentation, their valuing of the unconscious as a potential source of creativity, their academic referentiality, and their apparent disdain for the general reader, his loyalty to time-honored ideas of what constitutes the subject of a poem and the best means of realizing that subject stands paramount. Wallace Stevens, who admittedly was a bit drunk when he said it, and whether drunk or sober was more determined than most to find ways of expressing the inexpressible, once said to Frost, "The trouble with you, Robert, is that you write about subjects." And Frost himself would have recognized what Stevens meant, while not necessarily interpreting the judgment as an insult. Frost once told his friend Sidney Cox that a subject has to be held clear outside me with struts, and as it were, set out for an object. The subject must be an object. Compare this to Eliot's comment in The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism, and the two poets seem to be polar opposites. The chief use of the meaning of a poem, Eliot says in that essay, in the ordinary sense, may be to satisfy one habit of the reader, to keep his mind diverted and quiet, while the poem does its work upon him, much as the imaginary burglar is always provided with a nice bit of meat for the house dog. Very good. Yet the divergence between Eliot and Frost is not all that it seems. Resistant as Frost might have been to the central tenets of modernism, he does have things to say about the operations of poetry which come close to forming a sympathetic corollary. Here, for instance, is a well-known passage from one of his letters to Louis Untermeyer. A poem is never a put-up job, so to speak, Frost says. It begins with a lump in the throat, a sense of wrong, a homesickness, a lovesickness. It is never a thought to begin with. It is best when it is a tantalizing vagueness. It finds its thought and succeeds, or doesn't find it and comes to nothing. It finds its thought or makes its thought. I suppose it finds it lying around with others, not so much to its purpose in a more or less full mind. Let's say again, a poem particularly must not begin with thought first. Some of the impetus for this argument comes from the same source as Keats tapped in a letter he wrote to his brothers George and Tom in December 1817, in which he discussed what he meant by negative capability, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And tapped again when he wrote to his friend John Hamilton Reynolds on the 3rd of February 1818, telling him that we hate poetry that has a palpable design on us, and if we do not agree, seems to put its hand in its breeches pocket. But in saying what he did to Untermeyer, Frost was also alluding to his own particular verse theory, which is best known to us as the sound of sense, and can be briskly summarized in his own words as the dramatic tones of meaning struck across the rigidity of a limited meter, out of which come endless possibilities of tune. In the preface he wrote for the first edition of his collected poems in 1939 and retained in all subsequent editions, the preface which has the title, The Figure a Poem Makes, Frost insisted that in order for a poem to make any sort of figure, quote, we need the help of context, meaning, subject matter, but was simultaneously at pains to say that the object in writing poetry is to make all poems sound as different as possible from each other. And this emphasis on sound is as much a way of realizing the subject of a poem, of allowing things that are implied, unsaid, understated, or even unsayable to become manifest, as a way of clarifying meaning. Listen to a part of his early dramatic monologue, Home Burial, in which the grieving and emotionally inhibited parents converse on the stairs of their house, overlooking the plot in which their dead child is buried. She let him look, sure that he wouldn't see, but at last he murmured, oh, and again, oh. What is it? What? She said. Just that I see? You don't, she challenged. Tell me what it is. The wonder is I didn't see it once. I never noticed it from here before. I must be wonted to it, that's the reason. The little graveyard where my people are. So small the window frames the whole of it. As the almost too painful to mention subject of the child's grave is raised hesitatingly into view here, Frost animates the patterns of the speakers' voices as a means of conveying their stifled feeling. It's a far cry from the kind of hesitations I was talking about in Prufrock a moment ago, but originates in a similar state of mind, self-consciousness and doubtfulness about the capacity of language to convey everything that the speakers themselves and their authors know is there to be conveyed. Sound, in Frost's case, and the way it's organized in his poems to release meaning other than that conveyed by the dictionary definition of the words that appear on the page, becomes not just a means of expressing the subject, but the subject itself, in a way that is both substantial and elusive. In the process, it enacts several of Frost's first principles as they're enunciated in his letters. A poem is never a thought to begin with, and in The Figure a Poem Makes. The sound is the gold in the ore, he says. The initial delight of a poem is in the surprise of remembering something I didn't know I knew. And again, like a piece of ice on a hot stove, a poem must ride on its own melting. Frost was far from alone in seeming to fight a rearguard action against modernism, while in fact addressing many of its central concerns by different means. Much the same could be said of his English friend and early advocate, Edward Thomas. Thomas, in point of fact, had independently evolved many of Frost's ideas about the sound of sense during the later part of his own career as a self-styled hack prose writer, principally in his study of Walter Pater, published in 1913, the year before Thomas began writing poems, and in The Pursuit of Spring, a mixture of topographical evocation and studious meditation, published in 1914, and in his prolific life as a reviewer. I won't labour the point by quoting from Thomas's prose now, but I will notice that in the poems Thomas wrote during the last 2.5 years of his life, he was extraordinarily alert to the kinds of implication and elusiveness that I've been noticing in Frost's sound world. Very often these things are voiced, insofar as they can be said to be voiced at all, by wild creatures, especially birds. I'm thinking of the pure thrush word of Thomas's poem, Thrushes, the bodiless, sweet la 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 of his poem, The Unknown Bird, and the language not to be betrayed in the poem, I Never Saw That Land Before. They're all articulate, inarticulate ways that Thomas uses to establish and manage the instability of the subjects that most interest him. Experience in his poems, and this is represented by their forms, which always contest the idea of fixed structure, as well as their content, is essentially evanescent, fleeting, likely to escape like smoke between our fingers. And in saying so, I don't mean to suggest that experience is therefore always and only an occasion for regret, though most things in Thomas are usually tinged with melancholy. I mean instead to say that Thomas squares up to what he feels is the truth about our experience of the world, which is what it evades, which is that it evades or avoids our attempt to pin things down. This, among other things, is what we hear at the end of his marvellous poem, Old Man, which is not about a geriatric, it's about a herb, which also shares that name. This is how the poem ends. I have mislaid the key. I sniff the spray and think of nothing. I see and I hear nothing, yet seem too to be listening, lying in wait for what I should, yet never can remember. No garden appears, no path, no hoar-green bush of lad's love or old man, no child beside, neither father nor mother, nor any playmate, only an avenue, dark, nameless, without end. I started thinking seriously and writing about Edward Thomas in the mid-1970s when I chose him as a subject of my graduate research. It says something about the changes that have taken place in the poetical pecking order during the last half-century that when I first suggested Thomas as my subject to the English faculty at Oxford, they doubted that he was worth my attention. Thomas, I was told, only wrote 130-odd poems, and most of his prose was required writing. He was associated with the Georgians, then and now a seriously unfashionable lot. He was at best a poet's poet. I had to exert myself to get my proposal accepted. Now, of course, and thanks partly to the great popularity of Adelstrop, another poem that makes a point of saying how difficult it is to say what it means, he's one of the 20th century's most beloved poets, in England at any rate. I even heard his name mentioned on the Archers once, as if everybody in the audience would know who he was. This change in his reputation can be explained by a number of things. Sometimes it takes a while for quiet-speaking poets to get the attention they deserve. Elizabeth Bishop is another example. Thomas's preoccupation with environmental matters suits the necessary preoccupation of our times. And, which is a different sort of point, the battle lines which were drawn up in the mid-20th century between modernists and non-modernists, composed largely of those poets Donald Davey identified as belonging to the English line, have become a great deal less rigid in recent years. During the course of this reconciliation, Thomas has been identified, rightly in my view, as a kind of bridge between the pre-modernist and modernist-dominated worlds. His language and forms contain many Georgian attributes. There's even a sprinkling of urs and tissies and neaths. But his sensibility looks forward to the post-war world that he did not live to see. He once described himself, taking the phrase from a short story by Turgenev, as a superfluous man. Eliot would have known what he meant. Which brings me to Larkin, who greatly admired Thomas, but notoriously had no truck with modernism, and jingoistically complained that it was an American disease which had spread across the Atlantic and infected native stock. Poetry has lost its old audience and gained a new one, he lamented in his essay, The Pleasure Principle. This has been caused by the consequences of a cunning merger between poet, literary critic, and academic critic, three classes now notoriously indistinguishable. Elsewhere, he lambasted Pound, Parker, and Picasso as the purveyors of chaos and incomprehensibility, and elevated Thomas Hardy and John Betjeman as writers whose emphasis on clarity, musicality, and plain good sense was the epitome of qualities he most valued in writing. In the midst of these blastings and blessings, which it's tempting to interpret as equivalent to his political beliefs, oh, he enthused to one of his interviewers, I adore Mrs. Thatcher, the question of what might constitute a subject and whether it could or should be regarded as an elusive entity scarcely arises. I think, he said bluntly in his Paris Review interview, a poet should be judged on what he does with his subjects, not by what his subjects are. And that's as far as it goes. You must realize, he said at the end of the same interview, I never had any ideas about poetry. To me, it's always been a personal, almost physical release or solution to a complex pressure of needs. Wanting to create, to justify, to praise, to explain, to externalize, depending on the circumstances. And I've never been much interested in other people's poetry. One reason for writing, of course, is that no one's written what you want to read. It's quite possible that what Larkin means by this last phrase is that for good and for ill, no one could write the poems that we write ourselves. It's a point that Auden liked to make. If we take it at face value, though, it needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, especially the part about not being much interested in other people's poetry. Larkin may not have read many of his contemporaries with enthusiasm. In fact, he admired very few of them, Betjeman, Stevie Smith, Gavin Ewart. But the fabric of his poems proves that he is, in his way, a highly literary poet. For all the emphasis he places on speaking plainly about everyday matters of human interest, his lines are laced with references to quotations, with references to or quotations from other poets, as even a quick glance at the contents of his collected poems makes clear. Poetry of Departures, I Remember, the title of a well-known poem by Thomas Hood. Lines on a young lady's photograph album. Sad Steps, a phrase from a sonnet by Philip Sidney. Vers de Société, This Be the Verse, a phrase from Robert Louis Stevenson's poem Requiem. These are not the sorts of title an unreadily author might choose, But despite this, and despite the fact that Larkin had a much greater interest than he declared in the poetics of the same French symbolists who influenced Eliot, think how that final image of the poem High Windows presents itself as something that comes to him rather than words. There's no denying that he refuses to follow in the footsteps of the modernists when it comes to formal experimentation, to matters relating to the unconscious, to questions of difficulty, and to the question of what a subject might be and how it might appear in a poem. He characteristically meets his subjects foursquare, without equivocation or suspicion, like a man sitting down to a plate of meat and 2 veg. Ambulances, a poem from Larkin's collection, The Whitsun Weddings, is a good example of what I mean. Closed like confessionals, they thread loud noons of cities, giving back none of the glances they absorb. Light, glossy grey, arms on a plaque, they come to rest at any curb. All streets in time are visited. Then children strewn on steps or road, or women coming from the shops, past smells of different dinners, see a wild white face that overtops red stretcher blankets momently as it is carried in and stowed, and sense the solving emptiness that lies just under all we do, and for a second get it whole, so permanent and blank and true. The fastened doors recede. Poor soul, they whisper at their own distress. For borne away in deadened air may go the sudden shut of loss round something nearly at an end, and what cohered in it across the years, the unique random blend of families and fashions, there at last begins to loosen. Far from the exchange of love, to lie unreachable inside a room, the traffic parts to let go by, brings closer what is left to come, and dulls to distance all we are. Once the poem finds its true conversational note, those loud noons of cities in line 2 seem to belong to a different, earlier Larkin, who favoured more metaphoric language. It proceeds along the same lines as most of the poems he wrote in his prime. It sets up its subject, the activity of ambulances, with novelistic accuracy and attention to detail, arms on a plaque, red blankets. Takes pain to adopt a point of view that's widely shared, rather than one that adopts an oblique angle I was talking about in relation to Owen's poems. All streets in time are visited, all we are, and establishes a truth which can be universally acknowledged. Watching ambulances going about their business is a reminder of mortality, and anyone whisked away behind their closed doors is likely to realize they've taken a decisive step closer to their own grave. It's hardly an original idea, a point that Larkin anticipates in the remark I quoted a moment ago, but thanks to the accuracy of the writing, the plangency of the tone, and the deftness of the transitions between everyday details, those smells of different dinners which recall the smells of steaks in passageways from the first of Eliot's preludes, and more elevated thoughts, the sudden shut of loss, the exchange of love, Larkin is able to invest a familiar sight with fresh significance. In all these respects, the poem gives a very clear idea of how and why he achieved the status of national treasure during his lifetime. His poems are expert, to use Frost's formulation, at reminding their readers of things they've forgotten they already know. In Larkin's afterlife, of course, thanks or not to my biography and the evidence of his unpublished letters, this picture of Larkin as a slightly grumpier but still lovable version of Betjeman has become a great deal more complicated. The dislike of children, little scum, he called them, the suspicion of abroad, and the, quotes, difficulties with girls that he made no effort to conceal in his lifetime, and which most of his readers seem to tolerate or overlook, turned out to be the tip of an iceberg of which the subaqueous parts were comprised of misogyny, racism, and other equally obnoxious materials. Which means, among other things, that Larkin, in fact, presents us with a particularly complex version of the question I'm asking today about what constitutes the poet's subject and how those subjects are courted. On the face of it, he takes what is, by mid or late 20th century standards, an unusually old-fashioned position. Subjects appear front and central in his poems, and he presents them, investigates them, then moralizes about their significance in terms that value clarity as much as they do an Eeyore-ish kind of musicality. They are, in other words, poems that show the mind rehearsing opinions which have either already reached their conclusive stage or are in the process of becoming conclusions as they are shared with us. They are not poems which show the mind stumbling forward, parading its uncertainties, coming to rest in confusion. And yet, they conceal or withhold as much of Larkin's personality as they reveal. At least they do if you believe, as I do, that Larkin's reactionary politics, let alone his offensive prejudices, make remarkably rare appearances above the surface of his poems, at least the poems he chose to publish during his lifetime. Homage to a government with its complaints that next year we shall be living in a country that brought its soldiers home for lack of money is an exception proving the rule, I think. It's as if he took to heart Yeats's idea about having to choose between perfection of the life or of the work, and thereby managed to keep his published work clear of the prejudices which appear in his private correspondence and were evident in his conversation. I realize as I say this that there are plenty of readers who feel that Larkin's poems are indelibly tainted by what he said and felt off-page. But while I respect their point of view, I also want to insist that while there are a million things that we don't know about art, one of the things that we can be pretty sure about is that it's not merely a convulsive expression of personality. I also, however, want to ask a question which goes against the grain of this thought. Larkin engages so boldly with the subject of his own poems, whether they be ambulances or train rides from Hull to London, or rabbits with myxomatosis, or large cool stores, or old fools sickening in hospitals, or death itself, because he wanted his readers to recognize their own lives in what he was showing them. But might not this simplicity of approach also be a kind of feint, a way of distracting the reader from what is not being said by presenting what is being said with such skill, such novelistic relish, such unambiguous emphasis? It's not the kind of question which expects a straightforward answer. Once we start to think of a poem's subject as being the things it absolutely doesn't speak about, rather than the things it does speak about, however cautiously, we're likely to disappear down a wormhole, albeit a wormhole in which we have the pleasure of finding Henry James waiting to greet us, James being the great exponent of the palpable unsaid, not to mention Freud. But as I say, I think the question is worth asking, partly because avoidance in any context can be as much a strategy as presence, partly because it allows us to think of Larkin's treatment of his stated subjects as being in a sense confrontational, and therefore cast in the same mould as the opinions that his poems largely avoid mentioning, and partly for reasons which are closely allied to modernist and postmodernist decisions about when and where and how to create the impression of a mind thinking, rather than one of a mind that has completed its cogitation. Incidentally, the phrase "a mind thinking," as far as I was able to discover in the Riceley context I'm talking about here, comes to light first in an essay by Maurice Kroll in his essay The Baroque Style in Prose, published in 1969. In poems which show the mind actually doing its work, there might be a risk of obscurity, but there will also be an opportunity for inclusiveness, always provided that the mind work is registered with sufficiently ample and candid terms. I'm thinking as I say this about John Ashbery, who in a comment on his own poems in the Encyclopedia of Contemporary Poets said, "There are no themes or subjects in the usual sense, except the very broad one of an individual consciousness, confronting or being confronted by a world of external phenomena." I'm thinking of the language poets too, with their interest in ellipsis and discontinuity, their suspicion of coherence, their honest take on imprecision, and, despite their reputation for humorlessness, their often witty approach to these things. As an example of what I mean, here's Ray Armantrout's prose poem, Imaginary Places. Reading, we are allowed to follow someone else's train of thought as it starts off for an imaginary place. This train has been produced for us, or rather materialized and extended until it is almost nothing like the ephemeral realizations with which we're familiar. To see words pulled one by one into existence is to intrude on a privacy of sorts. But we are familiar with the contract between spectator and performer. Now the text isn't a train, but an actress/model who takes off her school uniform piece by piece, along with a cameraman. She's a good girl at being bad, all the time knowing better. She invites us to join her in that knowledge. But this is getting us nowhere. The poem is a sly hymn to the pleasures and dangers of reading. It begins by considering in an entirely comprehensible way, it actually literalizes and then unpacks the cliché of a train of thought, how reading someone else's words takes us to somewhere that is nowhere, while acknowledging that the journey is likely to expose certain things about the author and the reader that have the potential to be awkward. To see words pulled one by one into existence is to intrude on a privacy of sorts. But then without warning, everything changes, and the train of thought is no longer a train, but an actress model. Is she a schoolgirl or someone wearing a schoolgirl's uniform, who's engaged in some apparently salacious activity with a cameraman, posing in the nude perhaps, but with a bad conscience, all the time knowing better? Up to this point in the poem, we might therefore say that its subject is the complex, unnecessarily but riskily seductive relationship between writing and reading, or being read. But as soon as we've landed on that relatively solid ground, we're budged off it again. The final words of the poem, "This is getting us nowhere," are tantamount to a rejection or cancellation of all previous attempts at interpretation. Effectively, they make us doubt the value of whatever decision we might have taken about the subject of the poem, or about the very idea that the poem might have a subject at all. What we've been reading are merely words, sounds, that are as much a means of confusion as a form of guidance, and as capable of meaning nothing as they are of conveying something. When I left England and went to live in the United States in 2015, I did so partly for personal reasons. Like Eliot, in this respect, if no other, I believe that old men ought to be explorers, which is a line from the Four Quartets. But I also went for specifically writerly reasons. The job that I'd been offered at Johns Hopkins gave me a great deal more time for writing than I'd previously had, because it allowed me to stop sitting on the committees, judging the competitions, giving the readings, which had become too much a part of my daily life in England. And it enabled me to stand directly beneath the great Niagara downpour of contemporary American poetry and see if its impact moved my writing in a different direction. One of the things that the most exasperated me in England during my time as laureate was the expectation that I'd write poems about subjects that were not of my own choosing, especially poems about events in the calendar of the royal family, for which I had and have no strong feeling. And even when these demands were not being made, I seemed always to be within earshot of somebody telling me to write a poem about it, as though in accepting the role of laureate, I'd become a kind of slot machine. In America, I thought, where almost nobody knew who I was, and I could lie low, I could repossess my old laureate self and introduce it to the new self that I looked forward to meeting. I expected to encounter new subjects, in other words, and expected them to develop in me new ways of approaching them. Whether my hopes have turned out to be well-founded or not doesn't concern us here, though I think it has. What I do want to say, though, in relation to my theme, is that the Niagara downpour turned out to be immense in both volume and formal variety, and at the same time, remarkably concentrated in focus. Yes, of course, there are dozens of books published in the US every year, as there are here, which are made up of poems that depend for their subjects on random incidents, anxiety about the climate crisis, the death of loved ones, the birth of children, or pictures their authors have liked in whatever gallery they've recently visited. But for reasons which are to do with recent movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter, with the surge in demand for greater recognition of the rights of Americans whose families are a part of the Latinx and Asian diaspora, and with the promotion and defense of LGBTQ rights, the overwhelming mass of contemporary American poems are engaged with identity politics. In many cases, these poems, to borrow a phrase from Seamus Heaney, seek to spell an exact proposition. To say, to hell with the dangers inherent of having a palpable design on the reader, and give a full-throated roar instead that shows their authors think it's too late in the history of injustice to spend any more time waiting to reap the rewards of an indirect approach. Their primary intent, their purpose, is to give the force of intimate witness to general articles of faith, to bind groups together and give them a voice, to speak truth to power, and to make that truth compelling and memorable. But no matter how much sympathy I might feel for their message, I doubt that I'm alone in feeling that such poems, in order to achieve and accelerate their argument, often burn their poetic fuel very quickly. In order to accelerate their argument, often burn their fuel very quickly. Inevitably, this means that their longer-term value has more to do with the significance of their content and its relation to the moment at which it's delivered than it has to do with the other awards I look for in poems: linguistic, philosophical, technical, and so on. You've all seen examples of the sort of thing I mean, and I don't need to quote them here. What I'll do instead is to say that the poets who explore identity politics in ways that make them heirs to the kind of slant writing that I've been talking about are also many and various. for the use they make of redaction, redirection, euphemism, collage, redeployment of historic documents, and other ingenious sleights of hand and mind. Take a bow, Reginald Dwayne Betts, Jericho Brown, and many others whose names may or may not mean things to you. Individually and collectively, the impact of these poets and others like them is so strong. It occurs to me that literary historians in the future might well look back on this time as a golden age of protest poetry. Even while it makes nothing happen in a legislative sense, it still defines the mood and character of our age in much the way that Auden, who of course coined the phrase "poetry makes nothing happen," defined the mood and character of the 1930s. As an example of what I mean, let me end by looking at a poem called appropriately "The Tradition" by Jericho Brown from his book of the same name, first published in 2019. Here it is. Begins with 3 flower names. Aster, nasturtium, delphinium. We thought fingers in dirt meant it was our dirt. Learning names in heat, in elements classical, philosophers said could change us. Stargazer, foxglove. Summer seemed to bloom against the will of the sun, which news reports claimed flamed hotter on this planet than when our dead fathers wiped the sweat from their necks. Cosmos, baby's breath. Men like me and my brothers filmed what we planted for proof we existed before too late, sped the video to see blossoms brought in seconds, colors you expect in poems where the world ends, everything cut down. John Crawford, Eric Garner, Mike Brown. This not formally rhymed, but full of rhymes, sonnet is at once fierce, focused, angry, and subtle. Restrained even in one crucial respect, its principal subject, police violence against African Americans, is not unveiled until the final line. John Crawford was killed by police in 2014 when he was buying a BB gun in a Walmart store in Dayton, Ohio. Eric Garner died the same year in New York City, in the New York City borough of Staten Island, after a member of the NYPD had effectively strangled him in a chokehold. And Mike Brown was shot by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, also in 2014. But while these names and their tragic history form the climax of the poem, the way they embody injustice extends far beyond the grim facts of contemporary police brutality. Those flowers we hear about in the early part of the poem, with their sinister bruised colours of purple and lilac and red, introduce us to a scene in which the speaker remembers himself as a younger man, exploring the ways in which he didn't feel that he belonged in the circumstances of his own life. Did a spot of gardening amount to a form of physical ownership? Does invoking the white tradition of pastoral writing mean that he could easily associate with it? Stargazer implies not. Having registered this form of frustration and exclusion, the poem then glances at the long and grievous history of these things, including the history of slavery, as it remembers our dead fathers who wiped the sweat from their necks, before prompting us to think about the effects of climate change, the increasing heat described in news reports, then fast-forwarding through the present time of crisis and arriving penultimately at images of catastrophe, colours you expect in poems when the world ends, everything cut down. The 3 names that form the final line, which are the crystallization of this descent into disaster, are dead men who are victims of their immediate moment, but also casualties of a long history of cruelty and carelessness. The poem is an object lesson in economy and in how to subtleize the placement of a subject so that its resonances expand beyond the boundary of what is clearly stated. I said an hour ago that I wanted to take my mind for a walk and warned you that such an exercise would simply stop at some point and not offer much in the way of conclusion. But here's what I think in a nutshell. I accept that poetry can't do without a subject, and at the same time insist that it's more likely to find its greatest rewards when it avoids delivering tidy summaries of what the author has already thought and perceived. Poetry, for me, when it comes to the question of its subject, is more absorbingly a matter of suggestion, implication, and, when necessary, hesitation, in the sense that Valerie used the word, than it is a matter of statement and direct address. And having shown my hand in such an obvious way, it's time I stopped. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you. if you have anything you want to say, I will try and say something in response to it, so far away. I know it's a hideous moment, this, but it will pass. Sorry, yes.
I was quite struck by. I was quite struck by the philosophical problem of distance, which seemed to emerge in a lot of what you were talking about. And I was quite struck at the start by, we talked about Yates, and we talked about Hopkins, and I suppose it struck me that at some moments Hopkins, like in the Wreck of the Deutschland, is quite abstract from what he's talking about, and at other moments he's quite close to it, like when he's talking about his parishioners.
That's right.
And I suppose my question from, and obviously, you have, I'm sure everyone knows this poem, an Irish M for Seasons.
Indeed.
Where, we really simulate that kind of intimacy. And I suppose, I guess my question was, sort of, how do you personally confront this problem of distance? So how do you, is it ever dangerous? Is it a poetic position or a poetic sort of subject ever dangerous? I mean, how do you overcome that philosophical? How do you overcome barriers between?
Well, quite. I mean, what sort of strategies can one devise as a writer in order to make sure that this opening out feeling? Sorry, I'm straying away from the microphone here. In order to, what strategies can one adopt in order to try and allow this opening out feeling to occur? Well, it's a very good question. And it's not as though, and I don't suppose I'm alone in feeling like this about it, it's not as though I sit down at my desk when I'm about to start writing and think, okay, so here's the sort of notional idea that I have that I want to try and tackle in the next few hours. And what devices am I going to use to come at it from a strange angle? It's not quite as calculated as that, but it's not unlike that, actually. I mean, as you gather, I revere Larkin's poems for all sorts of reasons, but I would find it extremely difficult now to sit down and look at a subject kind of straight in the eye, like he does in that poem, Eminences, and characteristically in his other poems, which is to say that I partly look for other elements that I can introduce into the poem. And actually, that Yeats poem that you were mentioning is a good example of that, because there's so much else going on in that poem apart from the grieving for the man that it's named for. But as a rule of thumb, I think it is a good idea to have at least two ideas to lean against each other when you're writing a poem, and not point out what the connection might be between them. I mean, let them seek it out in the poem itself. Let the poem do its own work in establishing those sorts of connections. And I think that's probably the best I can, in purely sort of advising way, best I can do to answer that question. But maybe the better answer, or another answer related to it, is simply to say, simply to be aware of the problem, if it is indeed a problem. I mean, this room is probably full of people who don't think it is a problem, but I have found it to be a problem because poems that address their subject too head-on do, I think, run the risk of exhausting it more quickly. So a bit of deviousness is called for. Very, very often when I'm talking about poems, and I'm having the feeling right now as I'm saying this, these sort of theoretical positions feel much richer when you're talking about a particular poem than they do when established as a kind of principle. The principle is very simply stated, I think, tell all the truth but tell it slant. But the practice of it, as you're implying in your question, is a much more complicated affair. But thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. A lot of the poems and quotes you discussed in relation to war and political matters. I was wondering how what you discussed relates to love poetry, which seems to, with the word you, require directness, or maybe even a specific person who is being addressed.
Yes.
And maybe even love requiring a degree of earnestness.
Quite.
Or is it expected of earnestness? So is there a problem in writing indirect love poetry, or is there something that's also renewing about that emotion and idea?
It's an interesting thought. The person that you might be writing your love poem for, if the poem is full of other things that are in direction they might not be best pleased about. But as you're talking, it's making me... I think that I've never been able to write a love poem, much to my wife's annoyance. But actually, perhaps this is why, because there's something in me that resists this sort of direct approach to it. But I think the same principles would, I mean, from where I stand, the same principles would apply, that bringing in all this other kind of stuff would be not a bad idea. Though love poems are very... I've been thinking about this a lot recently. Some of you know this, I realise, but a friend and I have just published with Penguin a gigantic anthology of elegies. And we begin our introduction by saying that all poetry is a form of elegy, because all poetry wants to stop time. This is, again, something we were talking about a little bit this morning. But there is, of course, a large body of other people who think that all poetry is love poetry, and I see what they mean. I mean, love poetry, or at least all poetry that's any good, does reach out its hand to the reader and wants you, the reader, to take it. And there is something, as it were, loving about the attention that a poem gives to the world. I find those sorts of poems comparatively easy to write, but the kind of the one-to-one business I've always found more complicated, perhaps for the reasons that I've been talking about here. But it must be the case that you could, mustn't it, that you could write a love poem which would get round this problem and have all sorts of other interesting things going on in it. But I'll leave that to you. So good luck.
Hello, just a quick question. I don't know anything about this poetry by heart. I just wondered if you could talk a bit about that. What happens to the subject of a poem when it's learned and recited?
It's just made manifest. I mean, and it's in the oblique sense and in the direct sense, I think. But just to say a tiny thing about poetry by heart, which I realise isn't quite your question. The idea for setting it up really came off the back of setting up the Poetry Archive. The Poetry Archive is this gigantic, some of you may use it, I hope you do, collection of poets reading their own stuff, which I set up when I was laureating. And I did it partly because it seemed a good and comparatively easy way, because the internet was just getting onto its feet at the time that we established it. A good way of getting poetry to people who might not otherwise have access to it, as well as sort of preserving the voices of people that would otherwise be lost. But it was also a sort of gigantic manifestation of a core belief of mine, which I was touching on when I was talking about Frost in that talk, about how the meaning of things is contained in the sound that the poem makes, just as much as it is in the dictionary definition of the words that we see written down on the page. The ear is the best reader, Frost says, and I feel that's right. And it seemed a natural step from that to see whether there was any appetite to set up in a kind of amiably competitive, I mean, in other words, not ferociously competitive, but sort of amiably competitive way, some means of getting kids learning poems by heart, which seems to me a very good idea sort of in principle. And to my great delight, schools did take to it in droves, and it's now in its, 15th year or something, and a very large percentage of the schools in England anyway do enter into it, and it gives a lot of pleasure to a lot of people. And it also is a means of laying down like gold bars in these kids' poems, which they will, in some form or other, have in them forever. So this was, as I say, all a way of making, in that case, dramatic, the connection between page meaning and aural meaning. And I'm not quite sure whether it still runs in the same way. I think it does, but we compiled a gigantic anthology of poems that were the poems that were sort of eligible for learning, as it were. It's a bit bossy of us to do that, but it was really meant as a sort of help so that people didn't have to scurry around and look for poems. And I think the longest poem is a couple of pages, and the shortest is a sonnet. So they're of a length that the kids could reasonably be expected to learn without driving themselves crazy. I didn't particularly have in mind when I was putting the poems in that anthology, I didn't particularly have in mind the sorts of feelings that I now have about subjects. But I dare say if I looked at it again, I would see that I was playing true to form and choosing poems which had these sort of means of diversification that we've been talking about.
Principal, esteemed colleagues, it falls to me to thank Professor Motion for allowing us to follow his mind as it followed this line, like Paul Clay's extraordinary, discursive and historically wide-ranging journey from Elpenor to the language poets to Jericho Brown. Along the way, for me, I want some recollection and tranquility to put all together all of the amazing ideas that have come out and made me think about what it is we're doing as poets and why the subject resists us so much, at the same time as appealing to us, like Elpenor, to honour it, to bury it properly, and to remember it. But I was coming back to Seferis when he talked about the Argonauts, and he talked in the end about how the heroes die one by one on the journey, and they're buried with their oars marked, like Elpenor. Yeah. And the end of the third, I think it's the third Argonaut poem, he says, no one remembers them, no one remembers them. Justice. And there's this terrible feeling that there's somehow kind of justice, that things pass away in time. And at the same time, as you say, every poem ends up being an analogy because it has to recognize this and allow the subject to slip away without fully grasping it. It's deeply moving to me in my practice, and I want to thank you very much. I know everyone here will join with me in thanking you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.